Elias, you keep on saying that self-realization is very simple and effortless. Would you tell us what self-realization is, and why, if it's so simple, it is so hard for people to experience it so they can be self-realized and eventually be liberated from a life of suffering under the ego's control?
I'm just a simple guy, Michelle. I am no different or better than other people because self-realization is our true nature. Even Buddha did not really say he was enlightened. He said that he was awakened, that I can also claim. I am just awakened from the dream I was living believing I am my ego story in my mind. Self-realization is just this simple awareness and knowing that we are conscious without thinking. It is being aware of our presence, experiencing our emotions and thoughts and the external world's activity of sounds, sights, and smells. We are the observer aware of our bodies being alive and experiencing these internal and external events. We are not the body experiencing being alive, nor what is perceived or the way it is perceived. It is the presence behind the eyes looking at the world or behind the ears listening to sounds. The difficulty in self-realization is not so much that we don't recognize presence or understand what it is. The challenge lies in our inability to rest long enough in that presence and the awareness of simply knowing our being. We struggle to relax into that awareness, to embrace the nothingness, the space, and the emptiness that comes with being conscious of our own awareness. When we catch glimpses of truly knowing our existence, being conscious of our awareness of simply being, the mind often becomes uneasy. It tends to create a sense of urgency or fabricate an imaginary emergency to pull us away from the peace, happiness, and serenity that this experience of being can bring into our lives. That is because the ego created in our minds functions as an automatic and robotic cycle, constantly recycling our self-concept, which is rooted in fear, desire, and a sense of lack. It fixates on repeating the narrative of who we are and what we fear, lack, or desire. This survival mode activates the amygdala in our brain, heightening our sense of urgency and triggering an emergency response. The fact is not that we don't know it or haven't experienced the real self at times. The real self being our awareness of simply being, also known as pure consciousness. It's just that some of us might have experienced it but didn't recognize it as our true self because the mind wouldn't allow us to rest and relax in that state of simply being aware of our awareness. And in that state of being aware of our awareness, we need to stay long enough to solidify our true self as consciousness, and from there, clearly see that the ego thoughts, our self-concept, who we believe we think we are in our mind, is only a mask that we use to interact with others in society. But that mask, our ego, our self-concept, has convinced us that it is who we are. Self-realization is finding and directly experiencing one's real nature beyond the circles of the mind, body, and ego. That is, it is to realize that you are not just the individual identity which you have built or clung to in life, but the infinite, eternal, unchanging awareness in which all experiences arise. Self-realization, in that sense, is the coming to realize one's true wholeness and seeing that one was never truly separate from the vast web of interconnectedness. Though pretty simple, self-realization turns out to be elusive because a lifetime of conditionings and attachments runs pretty deep. Here's why. Identification with the ego. The ego thrives on maintaining a sense of separation and individuality. It creates stories, fears, and desires that keep you entangled in the illusion of being a limited self. Letting go of this identification can feel threatening to the ego, which resists surrender, that is, relaxing in the awareness of being aware. Attachment to thoughts and beliefs. People frequently conceptualize themselves in terms of their thoughts, emotions, or beliefs, and consequently cannot step back and observe these mental events for what they are. They are just constantly occurring, just fleeting events arising within our consciousness. Societal conditioning. Society teaches the individual from an early age to seek fulfillment through accomplishments, identities, and things external, drawing the mind outward, not inward, where the true and real self of awareness is always present, calm, relaxed, and happy. Self-realization involves embracing the unknown, the empty space, the vast consciousness, and taking a leap beyond the intellect, which the mind is deeply afraid of and thus sticks to old patterns. The mind is not comfortable in silence, presence, and awareness. The mind's nature is activity, and it will draw you to various activities, planning, doing, and seeking happiness and satisfaction in external people, places, and things. Most people on a spiritual search seem to believe that self-realization is a cumbersome process to be undertaken through years of effort, rituals, or practices. Of course, such methods are useful for quietening the mind, but they constitute no prerequisites necessary for realizing your true nature, because we are what we seek to find. We only need to surrender to the peace and love that we are. The key to all of this is in simplicity and in presence. Self-realization is not to be gained because it is your real nature. The effort lies not in becoming something new, but in getting rid of all the layers of illusion that obscure what has always been. Such barriers may perhaps be dissolved through the gentle practices of mindfulness, meditation, self-inquiry, or merely resting in the immediate awareness until one returns to that effortless realization of who one really is. But the mind will resist what is.
We often hear that the ego resists what is, but is that really the case? What's actually happening when we feel resistance?
That's such an important distinction. What we perceive as egoic resistance isn't a conscious, willful defiance. It's more like an automatic reflex, shaped by our conditioning and past experiences. Imagine touching a hot stove as a child. Your instinct to pull away isn't a choice but a survival mechanism. The ego works the same way. It resists not to defy but to protect, based on what it's learned over time. This shift in perspective can invite compassion, both for ourselves and others. When we see resistance as a protective habit rather than defiance, we soften our judgment. It becomes easier to extend kindness toward the parts of ourselves that are simply trying to shield us from perceived harm.
How does this kind of resistance show up in our relationships with others?
Relationships are like mirrors reflecting not just who we are, but also the unhealed parts of those we interact with. Take the example of someone who reacts negatively toward you. It's often less about your actions and more about their internal world. Consider narcissistic tendencies. When someone with narcissistic traits criticizes or rejects you, they're often projecting their own insecurities and unresolved pain. Their behavior is less about your worth and more about their struggle to process their inner chaos. This understanding can help us move from taking things personally to approaching such interactions with curiosity and compassion.
Let's explore the ego's relationship with truth and love. Why does it often struggle to accept them?
That's a fascinating question. The ego, shaped by fear and pain, struggles to process love and truth because they challenge its narrative of separation and lack. It's like playing a symphony through a broken speaker. The beauty gets distorted. In relationships, this distortion often leads to misunderstandings. Imagine showing unconditional love to someone deeply entangled in their egoic patterns. Instead of feeling uplifted, they might feel threatened or defensive because love exposes the vulnerability their ego works so hard to conceal. This dynamic shows why love and truth, while healing, can also be deeply uncomfortable for the ego.
Can you give a relatable example of how the ego creates suffering in everyday life?
Absolutely. Picture this. You're driving home from the grocery store, stressed and impatient even though there's no real rush. The groceries aren't spoiling, there's no urgent deadline, and yet your body feels tense. Why? This is the ego on autopilot, running an old script of urgency and stress. These patterns often have roots in past experiences. Maybe you grew up in a fast-paced environment or learned to equate productivity with worth. By recognizing this, you can begin to question these patterns and bring more mindfulness to such moments.
How does the ego's confusion affect our pursuit of wealth and status?
The ego often confuses external achievements with internal security. Take someone living beyond their means to buy a luxury car or home, not because they truly need it, but because they equate such possessions with validation or success. Even billionaires aren't immune. Consider Jeff Bezos, the richest man in this world, admitting he constantly thinks about making more money. This isn't about necessity, but about the ego's insatiable drive, which can never be satisfied by external accumulation. Understanding this helps us see that true contentment comes not from getting more, but from disentangling ourselves from the ego's endless desires.
So, how do we break free from these patterns? Is it as simple as letting go?
The idea of letting go is often misunderstood. You can't let go of the ego by force, especially if you're still identified with it. That's like asking someone to release their grip on what they believe to be their entire identity. A more effective approach is to gently question the ego's assumptions. Start seeing through its illusions like waking up from a dream. The more you recognize that these patterns are not who you are, the easier it becomes to step into freedom naturally.
You've mentioned the ego is both rigid and chaotic. How does that impact spiritual practice?
The ego is like a fortress with cracks. It's rigid in its defenses but unpredictable in its reactions. This duality means that no one-size-fits-all approach works for everyone. Some may need intellectual clarity to understand the ego's games, while others might require emotional healing or mindfulness practices to anchor themselves. The key is to work with the ego's unique dynamics rather than against them. So, observing the patterns of the ego and understanding its mechanisms can be a powerful step toward dissolving the illusions it creates. However, the process is less about actively removing layers and more about recognizing that these layers were never truly part of your essential nature. By watching the ego's patterns, such as its fears, desires, and need for validation, you begin to see them for what they are, transient and conditioned reactions, rather than an inherent part of your true self. This awareness naturally diminishes their hold over you, no matter how unpleasant thoughts and emotions come and go fast. When you see that these patterns are not you, you can detach from identifying with them. Instead of saying, "I am anxious," you might begin to see it as, "Anxiety is arising in my awareness." This shift in perspective creates space for deeper self-awareness. The ego manifests differently for everyone, shaped by personal history, culture, and experiences. By understanding your own unique egoic patterns, you can address the specific illusions that are most compelling to you. Once you see the ego's patterns clearly and stop feeding them with belief or resistance, they lose their power. The layers of illusion begin to dissolve on their own, revealing the unchanging awareness that you already are. Self-realization is not something the ego does or achieves. It's a recognition that happens when the ego's activity is seen for what it is. It's not about fighting or fixing the ego, but simply observing it with curiosity and non-judgment. Rather than actively seeking to remove anything, remaining present and aware is key. In presence, the ego's illusions cannot sustain themselves. As you deepen your presence, the truth of who you are, pure awareness, becomes self-evident. So yes, Observing the ego and understanding its patterns is a practical and effective way to begin peeling back the layers of illusion. However, the final step is the effortless recognition of what has always been present, the real you, beyond the ego and its stories.
Created by Elias Stassinos. Thank you for watching. If you found the video helpful, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to support us.